So picking up, like we said, those attitudes can vary a lot of times depending on what's going on socially. So think about that. We're living through in groups and out groups part of history right now. We have a lot of groups, whether it's Black Lives Movement or the police, whatever those ins and out groups are, there's conflicting views as to who's part of that in group and who's part of that out group. So it's creating a very competitive kind of attitude that's occurring between these different groups. All right. So primary and secondary groups can both act as reference groups. Reference groups means that there are groups that set a standard for sort of guiding our own behavior and attitudes. So what we see is that the family we belong to obviously affects our actions and our views, right? There were probably times while you were growing up when you decided not to do certain things with your friends to avoid disappointing or upsetting your parents, right? Or maybe on the other hand, your friends maybe were part of that reference group for you, and you probably dressed the way they did or did things with them, even if it was against your parents' wishes or because just all in all, they were your reference group. That's who their opinions mattered at that point in time. So some of our reference groups are groups to which we do not belong to, but maybe we want to, right? Think about it. When you were a little kid, maybe you dreamed of becoming an astronaut, playing dress up and being like one, right? So a lot of times some high school students might not belong to that cool clique in school, but may still dress like the members of that cool clique. I used the example earlier of the VSCO girls, right? Sort of that concept that sometimes we behave, dress, use materialistic kind of concept or pieces in order to feel like we belong in that sense, either in hopes of being accepted as a member or simply because they just admire that dress and style of its members, right? Samuel Stouffer and colleagues demonstrated the importance of reference groups in a study that was done of American soldiers during World War II. So what this study did was it looked to determine why some soldiers were more likely than others to have low morale. So what Stouffer did was found that the actual objective nature of their living conditions affected their morale less than whether they felt other soldiers were better off or worse than what they were. So even if their own living conditions were fairly good, a lot of times they were likely to have low morale if they thought other soldiers were doing better. Another factor sort of affecting their morale was whether they thought they had a good chance of being promoted. So soldiers that were in high promotion rates were paradoxically a lot more pessimistic about their own chances of promotion versus soldiers in units with low promotion rates. So what we were seeing was that former soldiers were dismayed by seeing so many other men in their unit getting promoted and felt worse off as a result. So in each of these cases, Stouffer concluded that the soldiers' views were shaped by their perceptions of what was happening in their reference group of other soldier groups. So they felt deprived relative to the experiences of members of their reference group, right? So what their peers were thinking was extremely important to them, and they adjusted their views accordingly. So that concept of relative deprivation sort of captures that particular process when we look at it. And think about it. There are probably tons of reference groups we have. You know, when you're seeking advice or how to maybe choose what school to go to, what college, or what to do next in your life, right? What's your next step or career choice? You're probably asking family members, neighbors, maybe teachers, maybe even certain friends what their opinions are in these things. That's what we're talking about with reference groups. Now, think about that. All of us have these reference groups, and we use them to sort of use as a standard to evaluate ourselves. So when we look at this particular picture, how do you think that the reference groups of these members of the KKK who are demonstrating in Jasper, Texas, differ from those of that police officer who's protecting their right of free speech, right? So although the KKK and the police officer use different groups to evaluate their attitudes and behaviors, the process is still the same. Okay, so even though they're going to have vastly different beliefs, different values, different mindsets in these things, that process of reaching out to those reference groups to check in and to say, like, what are our thoughts? Is this right or wrong, right? There's different groups in which they're tapping into, but both of which that process is the same, where they're using those as that standard for guiding their own behaviors and attitudes, justifying why they are doing the things that they do or why they believe the things that they do. Right? Very interesting when we start to look at that stuff. I do want to go back a second and make sure that I clarify this. We all are part of social groups, and social groups consist of 2 or more people who regularly interact on that basis of mutual expectations. They share some type of common identity in that sense. So it's easy for us to see that we encompass so many different social groups, right? Our families, our friendship groups. Maybe it's just our sociology class. Maybe it's the other classes you attend. Maybe it's your workplace or clubs or organizations, right? We all are part of these social groups. But what's interesting is that we can break ourselves into different social groups into 2 related concepts: social categories and social aggregates, which we're going to get into. And I want to jump back here because we had talked about this briefly here. There we go. Social category is a collection of individuals who have at least one attribute in common, but otherwise don't necessarily interact. So think about it. Women is an example of a social category. All women have at least one thing in common, right? Their biological sex, even though they do not interact, right? Now, Asian Americans is another example of a social category. All Asian Americans have 2 things in common: their ethnic background and, of course, their residence in the U.S., right? Even if they don't not interact or share any other similarities. So when we look at these examples, gender, race, and ethnicities are all sort of good examples for social categories, right? Other examples could be like your religious preference, if you're Catholic or Christian or Jewish, right? Your geographical residence, right? Maybe even that social class. Now, what happens is sometimes we fall between a social category and a social group. That social aggregate is where we're looking at a collection of people who are in the same place at the same time, but who otherwise do not necessarily interact, except in more superficial ways, right? If you're at a sporting event, right, that crowd is part of that social aggregate, right? If you're at a movie or at a play, being part of that audience is part of a social aggregate. These are collections of people, not a social category, but because the people are there physically together. If you're at the mall and you're in a giant crowd, that's a social aggregate, right? You're not part of any group. You're not really interacting with any people, not necessarily having a common identity, just sort of at the same space, same time kind of thing, right? So it's important for us to look at those things when we look at how that impacts us, all in all. Okay. Social networks. The last piece that I want to talk about today is that these days in the job world, we often hear that word networking, right? It's one of those catchwords, networking. Basically means we're taking advantage of our connections with people who have connections to other people, right? Who can help you land a job. You don't necessarily have to know these other people. These are just people that can ultimately help you. But you do know the people who know them, right? You know that first piece of it. So that tie to that other person, whether it's weak or non-existent at all times, is very important because that involves you within that network, right? It's going to help you find that job. So modern life is increasingly characterized by things like social networks, or that totality of relationships that link us to other people and groups. And so through them and other people and groups, all in all. So some of these relationships involve really strong bonds, right? Maybe that was my professor. My professor knows how they sit on a board at the particular university that I want to get into. They have connections there, right? While other relationships might involve weak bonds. I do know them. They don't know this person as well, but there's a connection there, right? So Facebook and other websites have made possible networks just sort of crazy when we think about it, because all of a sudden now we can grow our social networks. It's done so many things. We can now get advice, we can borrow small amounts of money, we can help find a job, right? How often can you get on Facebook Marketplace and you can get jobs, or you can get rental units, right? When you need advice or want to borrow $5 or $10, who do you typically turn to, right? There's probably certain members of your social networks, your friends, your family, so forth. So maybe just send them a message or text them, right? Those indirect links help you connect to those social networks. They can help you find a job or even find better medical care, whatever it is, right? They help us connect us to things. Think about it. When you're sick and you go to the doctor, and if your doctor can't get the right answers, right? Your family doctor can't get those right answers, they refer you to a specialist. You know, they might not have any connections to them, but they refer you to a specialist in that area. Even though they're not part of their social network, it's because they know a little bit more. They maybe can treat you professionally, get you better connected to something in that sense, right? It's all part of us. Now, think about it. Maybe you have some nearby friends or relatives who are physicians, right? They can recommend certain specialists to you, right? It's all people lucky enough to have some type of connection and connecting you to that. So what kind of people have these connections? What kind of people have friends or relatives who are physicians or whatever that equivalent is, right? The point is that factors such as social class and occupational status, our race and ethnicity, and our gender affect how likely we are to have social networks that can help get us good jobs, good medical care, and other advantages, right? If you are rubbing elbows with high society, you might have a lot more connections than maybe somebody else does, right? What we're looking at here is that different races and ethnicities at time that maybe are roughly from the same social class might have not the same access as certain other types of groups. There's been a lot of studies that have been done that have looked at the race and ethnicity components with the same social class across the board, and have found that whites have an advantage over people of color in the employment world. When we start to look at other things like gender also matters in the employment world. In many businesses, there still exists an old boys network, right? Where male executives with job openings hear about male applicants from male colleagues and friends, right? The good old boy club kind of mentality. Where male employees at times are already on the job tend to spend more social time with their male bosses than do female counterparts. So these related processes make it more difficult for females than for males to be hired and promoted. Right? So think about that. To counter-effect these and to help support each other, some women form networks where they meet and talk about mutual problems and discuss ways of dealing with these problems. There's a network called The Links, Inc. It's a community service group where there's about 12,000 professional African-American women whose name underscores the importance of networking. So its member participants has so many chapters in like 42 states. So they sort of look at these things and discuss problems they've face as professional women of color throughout the world. What I want you guys to look at is the fact that there are a lot of different groups that are sort of the key building block of social life, but they can also have negative consequences. I want you to remember that primary groups are generally small and include intimate relationships, while secondary groups are larger and more impersonal. Reference groups provide a standard for guiding and evaluating our attitudes and behaviors. And social networks are increasingly important in modern life. And so that involvement in such networks may have favorable consequences for many aspects of one's life. We're going to end there. We're going to jump on bureaucracies in the next class. All right, guys, talk to you soon.